We're very honored to have with us today the director of Omo Child, John Rowe, and the programs officer at Tostan, Daniel Newton. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon.
So maybe we could just start with some brief introductions from you both. If you could maybe just tell us a little bit about kind of who you are and your connection to this story. So if we start with John, that would be great.
Yes, thank you. Andy, I'm a filmmaker, photographer. I've spent a number of years in Africa and other places in the world pursuing stories about people and cultures, especially cultures that are either changing dramatically or vanishing. And this film sort of came out of that experience in southwest Ethiopia that I had.
Fantastic, thank you. And Daniel, from you?
Well, I work at Tostan, and my background is law. And during my studies, I was really looking at culture and the way that people interact with the law and the way that it was failing them, and the real need to sort of understand where people were coming from. And that's why I came to Tostan, because it just has that really fundamental value of respect and working with people and their culture. And I've been there ever since.
Fantastic. Could you just give us sort of the 1 minute elevator pitch on Tostan? What does Tostan do?
So Tostan is an international NGO working in 6 countries with a holistic education program. We do class sessions in communities with facilitators from those communities to cover a range of topics from human rights, democracy, problem solving, hygiene, health, and even literacy and numeracy. What we noticed over our program is that participants start to develop critical thinking skills and an analytical framework for dealing with the issues in their communities and comparing them to their deeper values and to human rights. And the big thing with Tostan is that through that education process, a lot of community members have joined in a movement to end female genital cutting across the 6 countries where we work, and that's really a movement that comes from them. And today we've had 8,000 communities declare an end to female genital cutting and child marriage. But yeah, Tostan is just really about working with people in their culture and respecting that.
Brilliant, great, thanks so much. And very quickly from my side, so my background, I have 10 years experience working in the development field before moving to where I currently work in social enterprise. The majority of that time was working as a director of an organization called AfriKids in northern Ghana. And the founding project of that organization was working with local people to tackle a local issue called the spirit child phenomenon, which has very many parallels to what we were seeing in the Kara community, but had very many differences as well, but ultimately did end in many children facing infanticide. So there are very strong similarities there, whilst being punctuated with some significant cultural differences. So let's go over to John to start with. John, tell us, and this is a hugely emotive subject. We are dealing with child infanticide here. How did you approach this as a filmmaker in order to, in terms of your own personal connection to this, and then how did that enable or challenge your ability to tell the story of the local people?
Well, first of all, I have to describe the place I was. It's the Omo Valley in southwest Ethiopia. It's a place that National Geographic calls the last frontier in Africa. It's a very remote place with cultures that are hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years old. And I was fascinated by that because they were really untouched and unspoiled, for the most part, from the outside world. Some things had gotten in, guns had gotten in, some alcohol had gotten in, but not much more than that. There was no clean water, no medicine. It was a very rugged, difficult environment. And yet there was this rich culture, beautiful environments and people. And so from a photography standpoint, I was fascinated. And I spent about 5 years there assembling a body of work that I thought was historically important, but also very compelling artistically. And my guide and translator, who was a young man I got to know, ended up being the protagonist in our film, Lale Labuko. It was after 5 years of working with Lale as my guide, my cultural interpreter, that he told me about this infanticide, the killing of children who were believed to be cursed. It was a spiritual thing. It was a belief system that the several tribes employed in the Omo Valley. And when children were believed to be cursed, they were killed. And it usually happened at birth, but oftentimes it would happen at 2 years old, 3, 4, 5 years of age. So emotionally, it was really, really rather gripping. And Lale was secretly going off at night and at other times and rescuing children, risking his life to do that. And he rescued, by that time, 24 kids. And he needed help. And the only way I knew to help him would be to tell his story. And so, you know, not really thinking we were going to make a movie in the beginning, we were in a place and a time where to tell that story and to communicate this to the world, filmmaking was the only tool I knew how to do that. And so that brought around the movie.
Brilliant. So talking of tools then, Daniel, what kind of tools does Tostan use? I mean, you're facing, as you said in your introduction, other embedded cultural issues such as female genital cutting and child marriage. So John's bringing the tool of documentary filmmaking and of building understanding. What tools does Tostan bring to these kind of challenges?
Education. I mean, it's really about giving people information in a way that they can understand, in a way that's relevant to their culture, that they can then use themselves and decide how they're going to use it to actually reach the goals that they set themselves. It's not a sort of, we always talk about the difference between giving information and messaging, right? So you could come to an issue like this that's very emotive and say, I'm horrified, that's very bad, stop. But there's a lot more going on, and people are going to, as they did, react very negatively and shut down if you just judge them. I think the power of Tostan's program is that it's holistic. You're not coming in and you're not saying, I have a problem with X or Y issue. You're coming in and you're saying, I want to work with you, and I want to work with you towards general development. All of the very specific results that have come out, you know, ending of child marriage, ending of female genital cutting, these are people themselves deciding on these issues based on a broad range of information that we've given them, and them selecting the key pieces that they want to use. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it's about, you know, giving people information to make their own choices in a respectful way. That's our tool.
Great. I think what's interesting about that is you're talking about it being very kind of locally driven, and obviously that was something that was very clear in the documentary, that, you know, this Lale as a local person changing something in his own community. There is also this interesting part of the documentary where the government comes in. John, how do you see the role of the government in that process? It does seem to be at some point, maybe was it a catalyst to some of the change, or do you think it impeded some of the change, the pace of the change with the Kara community?
At the end of the day, I don't know that the government attempts to intervene were ever really effective. I don't think there was any outside influence that was really as effective as something Andy just touched on. And none of this would have happened. The rescuing of children and what happened after that would never have occurred had Lale Labuko not gotten an education. An education similar to what Andy's describing, and other young people in the tribe. Unfortunately, mostly men, mostly males, because the girls still aren't always allowed to go to school, but nevertheless, it's a start. So it's really because of the education that was able to percolate up. The government wasn't able to order or dictate or demand that the Kara stop the killing of children. It had to come from within.
That's really interesting. And obviously, I mean, education speaks to youth, and that comes across very strongly in the program, in the documentary rather, about the young people of the community demanding change and being some of the real change agents. In terms of your work, Daniel, how do you see the balance between the youth demanding change and changing some of these really inbuilt cultures, particularly with the the very strong position of elders in many African communities?
I think it's about bringing everyone to the table. And I think the really critical, and John obviously corrects me if this is a wrong analysis, but I think that the really critical moment for change for that community was when Lale came to everyone in a common meeting with everyone at the table and said, you know, what are we going to do? I mean, asking a question and getting people to actually start to have discussions where everyone's viewpoint can be represented and everyone can sort of have an opinion. In terms of youth and older people interacting, I think it's just a lot of it is modeling, a lot of it is older people seeing that young people's opinions can be useful, and that younger people have value in decision making. And that's from two things. I think firstly, it's an appreciation of their rights, saying, okay, I'll listen to you, I will actually, you know, you have something to say, you deserve to say it. But the second is seeing that, you know, it's seeing as believing. It's saying, well, you helped me with this information, you're being a good model, you are giving positive effects to my community through your leadership roles. So I think it's also through demonstrating, creating opportunities for you to show that they're actually capable of bringing things to the table.
Great. I think what we're sort of discussing here is the opportunities and the possibilities for change. But maybe I'm sure that everyone was as struck as I was at the ending of the documentary with some of those figures there. And off the top of my head, I think it's 200,000 population of Kara and 50,000 still practicing mingi tradition. John, what has the impact of the documentary been on that, if any, or what has happened in the community since the documentary's been made?
You know, Andy, there has been change in some of the villages and some of the community. There's also been resistance to change, and that resistance to change has been exacerbated by development that is now invading the Omo Valley. Specifically commercial farming, dams, oil exploration. Roads are being built to support that and those activities. And so people now, there seems to be this conflict between elders in some of these communities and the development that the government is allowing to happen without their knowledge or understanding of what's happening to their land, the land that they've had for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. They're now finding out really isn't theirs, and they don't have any say-so over it. So just a quick example. We're talking about education a little while ago with Daniel, and the Hammer tribe, 50,000, continue to practice the killing of children, continue to practice infanticide. And hopefully education was going to have an impact on that. And in some of the Hammer villages, girls were actually going to school. And when they progressed to a certain level at the local village school, they then could go to town to a more formal middle school. Well, at that middle school, these girls were sometimes sexually assaulted. And they would come back to their villages devastated, you know, ashamed, embarrassed, and all the feelings you can imagine. And the elders and some of the warriors did not react well. And they ended up killing a teacher. That teacher happened to be pregnant. And there was a huge conflict as a result of that. And about 35 government people, police, were killed. And this went on for 3 or 4 days, and there was heavy fighting. So we're talking about really very sensitive issues, and there's so many complex aspects of it. Mm-hmm. You know, to those elders in those Hammer villages, they unfortunately saw education as a way for their young women to be exploited. And this reinforced then, well, we shouldn't send them to school because bad things will happen. Every time we trust the government or we trust others, something bad happens to us. So we've got to stay the course. We've got to overcome these kinds of challenges. But you make progress and then you have setbacks.
Yeah.
You just have to try and continue that progress.
Interesting. So I mean, that notion of conflict when dealing with such embedded traditional belief systems, Daniel, how does Tostan, I mean, do you have a similar example, or how does Tostan go around challenging and overcoming those difficulties when they arise?
I mean, I think it's difficult just because, you know, our problem is that, so for example, at the very start of the program, when we first included human rights content, that led to people initially starting actions to stop FGC, it was seen as this attack on culture. And it was, I think, also, when we talk about, you know, development projects happening on people's land that they own and them not having a say in that, it becomes sort of this representation for everyone of this fight for culture. I mean, one of the women in the film said, you know, back in the day, we didn't wear Western clothes. I mean, this cultural practice, once there's resistance to it, becomes, for outsiders, it becomes a representation of people that are barbaric, and that's sort of like the blanket statement that's been given. And for people internally, it becomes a representation for all of the culture and sort of the risk of losing all of these ideas. And so I think that what John mentioned that was really important was the idea of trust. I mean, if you are in a conflict, you need someone that is trusted. We have a implementation of our program also in prisons in Senegal. And we were actually invited by the Senegalese government to do that implementation. But because of the nature of our program, we're very much trusted by detainees because what we're doing is seen as in their interest. But obviously in prisons where the conditions aren't great, you're going to have conflict between detainees and prison guards. And the way that Tostan is able to maneuver that is actually, we're trusted by, and it's quite weird to say that, but we're trusted by both the detainees and the prison authorities because we've worked on these relationships where both of them know that what we're doing is in their interests. And so I think it is, you always have to have someone externally or some member of either camp that can prove to the other side that they are actually working for sort of common good.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, I think that some of the themes you bring up there around empathy and trust are really interesting. And I think one of the things that I was really impressed about with the documentary is how, without having a narrator over the top, it was able to paint, to step away from this picture of the Kara tribe being barbaric, and that this practice, you know, had a cultural tradition and was important. But I think that that's a very hard thing for us to understand in many ways, those who come from a Western culture. And I think that, you know, there are lots of anthropological studies behind these kind of practices. And to what extent, I'd be interested, John, from your side, is from a Western understanding of these perspectives, of these local practices, what is important for us to be able to understand and to build empathy? Because it's so hard when it seems so alien and foreign to the worlds that we come from.
Absolutely. I think you're bringing up some really important points. Trust is huge, and that relationship building, before you can do anything else, you have to have that. So you can't just, you know, fly in, spend a day or two, and expect to have an impact. So that's something to understand. There was a second part of your question, and I'm sorry.
So from the audience's perspective, trying to understand, I mean, obviously you spend a huge time on the ground, Daniel spent a lot of time in the field as well, but it can seem so alien from, you know, someone sat anywhere.
And yet, for me personally, it didn't seem so alien. Mm. You know, human beings, people are people all over the world. And you know, people love their children all over the world. They laugh, they cry, they you know, see the progression of life, and really we're not that different. I think that's what I came out. Even though we look so different, we dress so differently, our lives are different, but the basic human traits are the same, and that's something very important to understand. If you look at some of the beliefs in the Judeo-Christian or even Islamic religions, you see things that some people have a hard time understanding. You know, you believe that happened, or this happened, or this fact or that fact. It's not so different or unusual. Things that we perceive that might hurt us, that's in the supernatural realm or the spiritual realm, is not so different than what they believe. And that's why in our film, it was important to hear from the elders who believe in it, just to hear why they believe. Why do they kill children? Do they enjoy killing children? Absolutely not. But they are so afraid that the entire village will be wiped out with drought or disease if they don't do that. They feel like they have no choice. So it's a belief system that we think is, well, that's silly. Why would anyone connect those two? Well, you know, when bad things have been happening in your community for hundreds or thousands of years and you have no idea why, these things evolve and these beliefs become real, and they're just as real as beliefs that we have in things that may not be able to be physically proven one way or the other. So I think it's human nature. I don't think it's that far away from where we are.
Interesting. And Daniel, do you agree with that? I mean, how does belief systems and interpretations of them affect your work? And how do you, moreover, communicate again to the Western world when you're communicating the work of Tostan? How do you explain, again, issues which are so easy to be seen as just as barbaric, things like female genital cutting?
Well, I think it's really important to, as Johnson, recognize that this is all just very common stuff that all humans do. I mean, an example that we give a lot in our trainings is we say, you know, the idea of a jinx, where, you know, someone says, oh, well, you know, we're absolutely going to get there on time, or my team is actually going to win. And people automatically say, no, you'll jinx it, right? It's completely irrational. It's completely weird. But that belief is so profound. And I mean, you know, if we look at the mingi practice of, you know, ideas of children being born out of wedlock, or, you know, that's not something that is that foreign to us as Western people, as something that is sanctioned socially and something that has consequences for the mother and the child. I think it's just understanding that, you know, these are universal ways that humans deal with situations and explain their way of living in the world. I mean, in terms of, in Senegal, we have a program that we call the reinforcement of parental practices, which is all of these beliefs that people have around children. You know, they think that the brain doesn't develop before the child starts speaking at 6, so there's no point interacting with the child, which obviously has an impact on early childhood development. Or children that are malnourished are seen as, you know, children that have been reached by spirits. It's just ways of explaining things that we run into, or, you know, and why would you know, without ways to test it, that we have in the Western world, that a child's brain development is not accelerating very quickly between 1 and 3 when the child is not talking to you. You know, it comes back to empathy of, you know, although these practices are extreme, they're community ways of dealing with these issues and explaining these issues to find a sort of logic in their lives.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, the only thing I would add to this is we had some very interesting work done by an anthropologist called Dr. Aaron Denham, who researched the work in northern Ghana with the spirit child phenomenon. And I think there was some really interesting, strong links to poverty and illness. And certainly the work that we saw in the north of Ghana, a lot of the infanticide was related to disability. So in terms of the burden that in an environment where there wasn't previously medical assistance, the burden that a disabled child would put on a community was really quite extreme, and that the community had found ways of dealing with that that enable the community to survive in the longer term. And I think that some of the more extreme environments in the Ethiopian Omo Valley also spoke to that, and there was some discussion of that in the documentary as well, which I thought was really interesting. Something else that I just wanted to pick up on that I found really interesting in the documentary in terms of building empathy was the translation. Having spent a lot of time in the field, I thought that the translation that was given to the documentary really helped be engaged with the subjects. But I know how difficult it can be when you're translating from an African tribal language to English. So John, I'd be really fascinated if you had any thoughts on that, about how you dealt with that in terms of a way of basically you were controlling the flow of information there. Yeah. How did you do that?
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's very, very difficult. Fortunately, I had an educated Kara who was with me asking questions and then giving me the answers, and I kept copious notes. And then those notes were helpful in our editing. And once we had rough cuts, we were able to then take them back to Kara English speakers and verify the translations, or actually receive translations. But it was hard to do that, for sure. Mm-hmm. That language barrier, particularly when it's not a Latin language or a Western language, it makes it very, very difficult. There is no written language in the Kara, so yeah.
Interesting.
That's why it appears to make the movie.
Yeah, right. And in terms of other ways of kind of building empathy, Daniel, in your work, in terms of building communication, we saw a lot of different ways of doing that, in terms of community meetings and in terms of letting different people speak. And there seemed to be that moment, that inflection point in the movie where suddenly the elders start to drive the change themselves. What kind of work does Tostan do to kind of to bridge that gap? How do you get from the point where there's that new idea that's coming on board to the point where the adoption goes from, there are two people that agree with Lale to there, and then there's, it's 40-60, and then that growth. What does that curve look like in practical reality on the ground in your work?
Well, we've actually worked quite extensively looking at that and, sort of the mechanics of the social movement. In terms of FGC, what we see is that, especially with FGC because it's linked to marriageability, communities that cut their women won't intermarry with communities that don't, because there's ideas around purity and that sort of thing mean that they don't want to intermingle. So what we've got is we've got an idea that we call organized diffusion, which is that we have a class of 25 to 30 people who are getting information on various subjects. What we ask each participant is to adopt a member in the community that they're going to share that information with. And then as we also set up committees in the communities to sort of manage development activities. And that committee of about 17 people will then lead larger actions to share that information with other communities. And so it is sort of that sort of growing process of that information spreading. There's two sort of key points. The first is what we call critical mass, which is when, instead of just sort of isolated cases of people that have banned FGC, that really do have to deal with the consequences of unmarriageability and having social death, really, of being able to be rejected by their communities, like we saw with the couple that moved across the river in the documentary. But once you've got enough people that are sort of changing their ideas, you get to this point where the train is moving and a lot more people can jump on. And then you've got this big tension. And there was a moment in the film when they mentioned that it got much more difficult. And I think that, for me, represented the moment when you had two camps that had a really big tension between them. And they were pulling either way. And what happens in that moment is you either fall back and you go back to the old way, or you fall forward. Everybody jumps on board because you finally got enough people that is now the new norm. And that is what is going to be in the community. But that tension point is really critical. And that's why, especially for us, human rights education is important, because being able to change people's values of the change, to say that this is a good thing, makes that much easier, because it means that a lot more people will join the movement and you need a lot less to get there. But yeah, there's definitely critical points that really need to be, that you really need to move forward and you really need to invest in to make sure that you get over the mark.
That's fascinating. And I think one of the things that impresses me so much about the work of Tostan is how you've really built that understanding into a program and looked to scale you know, those tools for social change throughout your work, and actually made it available to other people for trainings going forward, which I think is fantastic as a way to, you know, look to fall forward more often. So perhaps then to close us out, John, in terms of thinking about that role of falling forward, what else needs to be done? You know, you're describing that there's still significant challenges with the Mingi tradition in Ethiopia. And as we're hearing from Daniel, there are similar challenges in many other parts of the world with embedded traditional belief systems. What is it, what are you think are the real levers for change that the viewing audience, assuming presumably from a Western standpoint, can do and be a part of helping this kind of change you know, continue to go forward, so that we can fall forward more than we can fall back?
Well, as Daniel said earlier, and I concur, education is very, very important. So organizations like Daniel's and Tostan and others that have initiatives for educational projects, especially as they relate to human rights and social education, I think that's just terrifically important. I think it's a slow process, and we have to be patient. And we tend to want to, if we think change is necessary, we want to see change happen immediately. And it doesn't always happen on our schedule. It doesn't happen usually as fast as we want it to. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue, that you shouldn't make efforts to bring education, bring knowledge. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is empowering. And really, I think that is the way to sort of get enlightenment, if you will, is to do that through education. And not just in other countries, but even here in America, we need that as well. We all are growing. We all are trying to figure out what this big world is really all about and how it all works. And as I said before, people, even though they look so different and maybe culturally are so different, really aren't. We are really so similar in so many ways. And we have to just continue to keep open minds, be tolerant, be patient, and educate and bring awareness to the world as best we can in whatever way we can.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Daniel, last word to you. What can we do to fall forward more often, and how can the wider viewing audience support issues of traditional cultural beliefs change from their world?
Well, two things. I think generally what we've been talking about this whole time is just really coming from a place of respect, and really dealing with the way that people think and respecting their ways of thinking about things and their own journey. I think at the end of the film, they said, we ended the practice, but we ended it our way. And I think that's so important. Also, they want to learn more about Tostan. We have trainings in chess in Senegal. And we love having participants to come and describe the work that they're doing and really workshop with us the ways that our lessons learned can help them. But also we've got our website and we've got a lot of resources. It's just about learning and sharing and seeing what works. And I think that this film has really been a really excellent case study of how something like this, a practice that is at first looks so horrific can be ended.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely echo that. And John, just from my side, huge congratulations on what I think is an incredible documentary. And thank you both for joining us to build this discussion and help us think about how we can take what we saw in the documentary and think forward. So to both of you, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. And if you're watching this and you've missed the film, you can still see the film on SIMA until Sunday. And you can also look on the website for areas where you can take collective action and learn more about the film and the issue. So thank you very much to you both, and thank you everyone watching at home. And John, again, congratulations on a really fantastic piece of work.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet you and to be with you both. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks both.